In 1886, the British establishment exerted immense pressure to influence a high-profile trial, desperate to protect the crown from a catastrophic public scandal. This is exactly what you didn't know about Queen Victoria's family. We are investigating the case of Lord Colin Campbell, an innocent bride deliberately infected, and the most hedonistic syphilis cover-up in royal history. The destructive fallout of this scandal was anchored in the terrifying weight of the Argyll name. Born on March 9, 1853, Lord Colin Campbell was the fifth son of George Campbell, the 8th Duke of Argyll. The Dukes of Argyll were an institution. They were the hereditary chiefs of Clan Campbell, the undisputed masters of the Scottish Highlands. Their ancestral seat, Inverary Castle, was a fortress of political and economic power. For centuries, the Campbells had shaped the destiny of Scotland, and by the 19th century, they had seamlessly transitioned their absolute regional authority into immense political capital within the British Parliament at Westminster. The 8th Duke was a formidable intellectual and a prominent liberal politician who served in the cabinets of multiple prime ministers. Growing up in this environment meant that from the moment he drew his first breath, Lord Colin was heavily burdened by expectation. He was raised in a high-pressure ecosystem where personal desires were entirely secondary to the maintenance of the family's towering public image. However, the true invulnerability of the Campbell family and the catalyst for the catastrophic cover-up that would define Lord Colin's life was forged not in Scotland, but in Windsor Castle. The Argylls reached the absolute apex of British social hierarchy in 1871. In a move that permanently altered the trajectory of the Campbell dynasty, Lord Colin's older brother, John, the Marquis of Lorne, married Princess Louise. She was the 4th daughter of Queen Victoria. This was a deeply strategic and highly unusual royal marriage. Queen Victoria, breaking with generations of tradition that dictated royal children must marry foreign royalty, allowed her daughter to marry a British subject. This decision welded the Campbell family directly to the British throne. The Argylls ceased to be merely powerful lords. They became an extension of the sovereign herself. This proximity to the highest seat of power provided the Campbells with a shield of absolute invulnerability. They were now untouchable by standard social or legal metrics. But this unprecedented elevation came with a dangerous, unspoken condition. Because they were now family, any scandal attached to the Campbells was no longer an isolated family embarrassment. It was a direct existential threat to the crown. Any stain on the Argyll name would inevitably bleed onto the reputation of Queen Victoria, a monarch who had spent decades meticulously crafting an image of domestic purity and strict Christian morality for the royal family. Lord Colin was thrust into this protective yet suffocating royal bubble just as he was coming of age. On paper, Lord Colin Campbell executed his required role flawlessly. He possessed the classical attributes demanded of a Victorian gentleman. He was highly educated, attending Eton College before matriculating at Trinity College, Cambridge. He was handsome, articulate, and carried the effortless arrogance of a man who knew he owned the world. He moved seamlessly into the family business of politics, securing a seat as the Member of Parliament for Argyllshire in 1878. At 25 years old, he was a rising star in the Liberal Party, representing his family's vast interests in the House of Commons. To the public eye, he was the embodiment of upper-class virtue, a dedicated public servant, a loyal son to a great duke, and the respectable brother-in-law to a princess of the blood royal. But the architecture of Lord Colin's public life was an elaborate facade. It was designed to mask a private existence that stood in total defiance of the laws and morals he publicly represented. The pressure of living as an extension of the royal family, combined with the immense wealth and unstructured free time afforded to younger aristocratic sons, often bred a dangerous boredom. For Lord Colin, this boredom manifested in a descent into London's hidden, illicit underworld. The Victorian legal system was notoriously brutal regarding sexual deviance. Homosexuality was heavily criminalized, and any public hint of unconventional desires could result in hard labor, social exile, and total ruination. Yet the wealth of the aristocracy bought them a dangerous level of access and privacy. While working-class men were heavily policed and imprisoned for minor infractions, men like Lord Colin had the financial means to frequent exclusive, highly secretive clubs and establish private networks of indulgence. Historical analyses and the terrifying circumstances that would later unfold in court point to a specific and highly risky pattern of behavior. The Campbell brothers seem trapped in a cycle of maintaining public heterosexual facades while allegedly harboring different private realities. The marriage between the Marquis of Lorne and Princess Louise was notoriously unhappy, plagued by years of infertility and persistent hushed rumors within elite circles regarding John's sexuality. While his older brother's life was heavily scrutinized due to his direct marriage to the princess, Lord Colin, as a younger son, operated in a slightly deeper shadow. And in that shadow, he engaged in practices that carried catastrophic risks. Lord Colin did not confine his hidden life to the cautious, discreet encounters that characterized the private affairs of some of his peers. He exhibited a reckless appetite for crossing rigid class boundaries. In the late 19th century, a highly dangerous subculture thrived in the darker corners of London, far removed from the glittering ballrooms of Mayfair. Wealthy, untouchable gentlemen sought out the adrenaline of danger and degradation by purchasing the company of men from the absolute lowest rungs of the social ladder. This was the economy of the streets, heavily populated by transient laborers, dock workers, and soldiers of the Queen's Guard, who supplemented their meager incomes through clandestine sex work. This practice was driven by a toxic mixture of exploitation, the thrill of breaking severe legal taboos, and a fundamental contempt for the lower classes, whose bodies were viewed merely as commodities to be bought and discarded. Many modern historians believe Lord Colin plunged into this dangerous, unregulated environment. He weaponized his immense wealth to navigate these spaces, assuming his family name would forever insulate him from the consequences. But while the Argyle name could manipulate the courts and silence the press, it offered absolutely no protection against biology. The sprawling, unregulated sex trade of Victorian London was a biological minefield. In an era predating modern medicine, antibiotics, and basic understandings of viral transmission, these hidden encounters were not just illegal, they were lethal. The environments Lord Colin frequented were breeding grounds for one of the most terrifying and heavily stigmatized diseases of the 19th century. The specific details of the night his fate was sealed are lost to history, buried by time and intentional destruction of evidence. But the medical reality was stark. Through his reckless navigation of London's hidden underworld, Lord Colin Campbell contracted syphilis. In the 1880s, syphilis was not a curable infection. It was the phantom terror of the Victorian era. It was a death sentence but one that executed its victims slowly, publicly, and in excruciating agony. It was not merely a physical ailment. It was viewed as the ultimate manifestation of moral rot, a divine punishment for the sins of the flesh. The social stigma attached to the disease was so severe that doctors often falsified death certificates for wealthy patients to spare their families the ultimate humiliation. The progression of the disease was a nightmare of stages. The initial symptoms might recede, lulling the victim into a false sense of security before the bacteria returned to systematically dismantle the human body. It attacked the skin, the bones, the cardiovascular system, and ultimately the brain, leading to blindness, paralysis, severe dementia, and a deeply painful death. Furthermore, the medical treatments available to Lord Colin were arguably as barbaric as the disease itself. The primary medical protocol involved the heavy administration of mercury. Patients were subjected to mercury ointments, mercury pills, and mercury vapor baths. The treatment slowly poisoned the patient, causing teeth to fall out, excessive salivation, and severe neurological damage, all while completely failing to eradicate the underlying infection. Lord Colin was fully aware of his condition. His medical records, which would later become the explosive center of a national scandal, confirmed that he sought treatment from some of the most prominent physicians in London. He knew exactly what he carried in his bloodstream. He knew the agonizing trajectory of the disease, and he knew that it was highly contagious. Yet the primary concern of a Victorian aristocrat was rarely personal morality. It was the preservation of the public facade. Lord Colin's political career was advancing. His family's position, tethered to the Queen, demanded an image of stability and traditional respectability. A bachelor politician in his late 20s, particularly one surrounded by the quiet whispers of London society, was a liability. He needed to solidify his cover. He needed a mechanism to permanently silence any rumors about his private life and present a picture of absolute normalcy to the electorate and the crown. He did not need a partner. He needed a shield. And to acquire that shield, he was prepared to commit an act of staggering cruelty. He decided it was time to take a wife. The search for a suitable wife was not a matter of romance for a man in Lord Colin Campbell's precarious position. It was a desperate tactical maneuver. He needed a woman who possessed enough social standing to be acceptable to the Duke of Argyll and Queen Victoria, yet perhaps lacked the deeply entrenched, hyper-vigilant family network of the absolute highest nobility, who might employ private investigators to look into his London habits. More importantly, he needed a woman of undeniable beauty, vitality, and flawless reputation. Her purity would serve as the ultimate counter-narrative to the whispered rumors of his own corruption. He found his perfect candidate in the autumn of 1880 during a visit to the Scottish Highlands. Her name was Gertrude Elizabeth Blood. Before being reduced to a victim in a courtroom, Gertrude Blood was a force of nature. Born in May 1857 in County Clare, Ireland, to Edmund Magdalen Blood, a wealthy landowner of Anglo-Irish descent. The Blood family was highly respectable, financially secure, and deeply embedded in the gentry, but they did not move in the same untouchable royal-adjacent circles as the Campbells. Gertrude was not a fragile, stereotypical Victorian maiden waiting quietly in a parlor. She was a force of nature. Standing unusually tall for a woman of her era, she possessed a striking, commanding physical presence. She was fiercely intelligent, highly educated by a series of private tutors, and fluent in multiple languages. She was an accomplished equestrian, a talented artist, and possessed a sharp, inquiring mind that often made the men of her social circle uncomfortable. She was, by all contemporary accounts, radiant with health and an intense love for life. When Lord Colin met the 23-year-old Gertrude in Scotland, the attraction was immediate, though driven by entirely different motivations. For Gertrude, Lord Colin presented a dazzling prospect. He was 27, charming, intellectually engaging, and carried the aura of a man destined for national greatness. He paid her intense, flattering attention, masking his underlying desperation with the polished manners of a seasoned politician. For the Blood family, the match was almost unimaginably prestigious. Marrying into the Argyll family meant securing a connection to the very heart of the British Empire. It was the kind of alliance that elevated an entire family line for generations. For Lord Colin, Gertrude was the ideal solution to his escalating crisis. Her robust health and striking beauty would be the perfect public diversion. If he was seen on the arm of such a magnificent, highly desirable woman, the persistent rumors of his late-night activities in London's underground would surely evaporate. Society would see exactly what he wanted them to see, a young, virile aristocrat settling down to build a family. The courtship was swift and highly orchestrated. Lord Colin pressed his advantage, utilizing the overwhelming social weight of his family to sweep Gertrude and her parents along. Yet behind the scenes of this glittering engagement, a deeply sinister reality was playing out in the private consulting rooms of London's top medical professionals. Lord Colin's syphilis was not a secret to his physicians. As the wedding date approached, he sought the counsel of a prominent surgeon. The medical advice he received was unequivocal and damning. The doctor explicitly informed Lord Colin that his disease was in an active, highly contagious stage. He was warned in no uncertain terms that he was utterly unfit for marriage. To proceed with the wedding and consummate the union would guarantee the transmission of a fatal, incurable disease to his bride. The physician advised him to delay the marriage for months, if not years, until the symptoms could be managed or the disease entered a dormant phase. This is the moment where the story shifts from a tragedy of circumstance to a calculated act of violence. Lord Colin Campbell, fully informed of the catastrophic harm he was about to inflict, chose to completely ignore his doctor's warnings. His decision provides a chilling insight into the mindset of the Victorian elite. In Lord Colin's worldview, his need for a social shield completely superseded Gertrude Blood's right to health, safety, and life. The arrogance of his class dictated that his reputation was worth more than her physical survival. He viewed her not as a partner, but as a necessary collateral sacrifice to maintain his position in Parliament and his standing at the royal court. He silenced his doctors, suppressed his medical records, and allowed the wedding preparations to proceed without a single word of warning to the woman he was about to destroy. On July 21, 1881, Lord Colin Campbell and Gertrude Blood were married in a lavish ceremony. It was one of the premier social events of the season, attended by the elite of British society. As Gertrude walked down the aisle, radiant and optimistic about her future, she was stepping into a trap of unimaginable cruelty. She believed she was entering a partnership of equals, a life of political influence and shared ambition. She had no way of knowing that the man waiting for her at the altar was harboring a biological time bomb. The betrayal was immediate. The honeymoon, a period culturally designated for romance and the foundation of marital intimacy, became the scene of a quiet, unacknowledged crime. Lord Colin consummated the marriage. In doing so, He deliberately and knowingly passed the syphilis spirochete into the bloodstream of his young wife. The onset of the disease for Gertrude was swift and brutal. Within weeks of the wedding, the vibrant, athletic young woman began to experience terrifying physical symptoms. The initial signs of syphilis can be insidious, often mimicking other ailments, but the progression was undeniable. She suffered from severe exhaustion, mysterious rashes, and deep aching pains in her joints. The physical deterioration was rapid, but the psychological torture of not understanding what was happening to her own body was equally devastating. In the Victorian era, young women of Gertrude's class were kept deliberately ignorant about sexual health and venereal diseases. Such topics were considered entirely inappropriate for female ears. When Gertrude's health began to fail, she was initially confused and frightened. She sought medical help, completely unaware of the dark reality of her situation. When the doctors finally examined her, they recognized the undeniable markers of the French disease. The conversations that followed must have been harrowing. It was a common practice for Victorian doctors to actively lie to female patients about venereal diseases to protect the husband's reputation, often diagnosing them with vague ailments like neurasthenia or female hysteria. But the severity of Gertrude's condition, and perhaps the sheer brazenness of Lord Colin's actions, eventually led to the truth coming out. Gertrude was forced to confront a reality that shattered her entire world. She had an incurable, fatal, and heavily stigmatized disease, but the physical diagnosis was only half of the horror. The other half was the realization of how she had contracted it. Her husband, the man who had promised to protect her, had known he was infected. He had known the risks, and he had chosen to infect her anyway. It was not a tragic accident. It was a deliberate, cold-blooded act of self-preservation at her expense. The medical treatments that Gertrude was now subjected to were a secondary form of torture. To combat the syphilis, her doctors prescribed the standard brutal regimen of the era. She was heavily dosed with mercury. This treatment required her to ingest toxic pills and endure agonizing mercury vapor baths that left her constantly nauseous, her gums bleeding, and her hair thinning. The treatment slowly poisoned her system, adding to the immense physical agony caused by the disease itself. The radiant, energetic woman who had ridden horses through the Scottish Highlands just a year prior was now largely confined to a sick bed, her body a battleground against a relentless infection and toxic medicine. But Lord Colin's cruelty did not end with the physical infection. Having secured his alibi and successfully married, he showed absolutely no remorse or inclination to care for his sick wife. As Gertrude suffered through the agonizing early stages of the disease, her husband largely abandoned her. He returned to his parliamentary duties and, devastatingly, resumed his hidden life in the London underground. He left Gertrude isolated in constant pain and entirely dependent on his financial support. Under British law in the 1880s, a woman's legal identity was entirely subsumed by her husband upon marriage. She owned nothing. Her money, her property, and her body legally belonged to him. If she left him, she would be destitute, cut off from society, and branded a pariah. A wife leaving her husband, regardless of the abuse she suffered, was viewed as a scandalous breach of the social order. The system was meticulously designed to ensure that women like Gertrude remained trapped, silent, and compliant. Lord Colin banked heavily on this systemic trap. He assumed Gertrude would simply accept her fate. He believed she was broken by illness, and terrified by the prospect of social and financial ruin. He believed she would quietly retreat to a country estate, manage her symptoms in the shadows, and allow him to continue his life without interruption. He grossly miscalculated. Gertrude Blood was not a woman who could be easily broken. As the physical pain racked her body, a profound and hardening fury began to take root in her mind. She realized that the society that had cheered her wedding was actively conspiring to enforce her silence. She recognized that the Argyle family, with their royal connections and immense wealth, expected her to die quietly to protect their name. Lying in her sick bed, enduring the toxic mercury treatments, Gertrude made a decision that would send shockwaves through the very foundations of the British Empire. She decided she was not going to die quietly. She was not going to protect the man who had murdered her future. She was going to fight back, and she was going to use the very legal system designed to oppress her to tear down the facade of the Campbell family. She began to meticulously gather her evidence. She secured her medical records, documenting the precise timeline of her infection and the treatment she endured. She sought out legal counsel, a highly unusual and dangerous step for a married woman. She prepared to do the unthinkable, to publicly expose the private horrors of an aristocratic marriage and drag the brother-in-law of a princess into the unforgiving light of a public courtroom. The stage was being set for a confrontation that Queen Victoria's court would desperately try and ultimately fail to prevent. The legal system of the 19th century was meticulously engineered to protect aristocratic men and completely subjugate women. To understand the sheer scale of the mountain Gertrude Blood decided to climb, one must examine the brutal mechanics of the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. Before this act, divorce was essentially impossible unless you could afford a private act of parliament. The 1857 law moved divorce into the civil courts, but it was explicitly written with a double standard that codified male supremacy. If a husband wanted to divorce his wife, he only needed to prove one thing: simple adultery. A single indiscretion was enough to strip a woman of her children, her home, her reputation, and her financial security. However, if a wife wanted to divorce her husband, the law demanded a significantly higher burden of proof. Because male infidelity was quietly tolerated as a biological inevitability by Victorian society, a woman could not divorce a man simply for being unfaithful. She had to prove aggravated adultery. This meant she had to prove he committed adultery combined with another severe offense, such as bigamy, incest, desertion, or extreme cruelty. Gertrude's legal strategy was forced to hinge on this specific definition of cruelty. Her legal team had to argue that Lord Colin's transmission of syphilis was not an unfortunate accident within the bounds of marriage, but a deliberate, calculated act of physical assault. They had to prove that he knew he was highly infectious and that he willfully chose to expose her to a deadly pathogen. This was an unprecedented and highly volatile legal maneuver. It required exposing the darkest, most heavily guarded secrets of a man connected to the royal family in an open courtroom. In 1884, Gertrude struck her first blow. She did not immediately file for a full divorce. Instead, she filed for a judicial separation based on cruelty. This was a tactical decision. A separation would legally allow her to live apart from him and force him to provide financial maintenance without entirely severing the marriage bonds, a move that was slightly less socially destructive, but still highly combative. During the separation hearings, Gertrude's lawyers presented the irrefutable evidence of her physical deterioration and the testimonies of the doctors who had treated her. They brought forward the physician who had explicitly warned Lord Colin against marrying. Faced with the stark, undeniable medical facts, the court ruled in Gertrude's favor. She was granted the judicial separation, and Lord Colin was ordered to pay her alimony. For a brief moment, it appeared Gertrude had won a measure of peace. She had secured her physical distance and a small degree of financial independence, but she had fundamentally underestimated the ego and the vindictiveness of the Argyle family. Lord Colin Campbell was humiliated. A public separation based on his transmission of a venereal disease was a severe blow to his political ambitions and his standing in society. Rather than quietly accepting the verdict and the financial penalty, he retaliated with a scorched earth campaign designed to utterly destroy his wife's character and shift the blame for the disease entirely onto her. He immediately stopped paying the court-ordered alimony, cutting off Gertrude's financial lifeline and forcing her to rely entirely on her parents. But financial strangulation was only his first step. Lord Colin utilized the vast wealth of his family to hire a small army of private detectives. Their mission was straightforward: follow Gertrude, surveil her every move, interrogate her servants, and manufacture a narrative of serial infidelity. If Lord Colin could prove that Gertrude was an adulterer, he could achieve two critical objectives. First, he could secure a full divorce on his own terms, freeing himself from the financial obligations of the separation. Second, and far more insidiously, he could introduce the legal argument that he did not infect her with syphilis. Rather, she had contracted it from her own illicit lovers and passed it to him. It was a monstrous, audacious lie, directly contradicting all his own medical timelines. But in the patriarchal courts of Victorian England, a wealthy duke's son accusing his wife of promiscuity was a highly effective weapon. By early 1886, the situation had escalated past the point of no return. The separation had failed to resolve the conflict. Driven into a corner by his financial embargo and his relentless harassment, Gertrude took the final fatal step. She filed a petition for an absolute divorce on the grounds of his adultery and cruelty. Simultaneously, Lord Colin filed a cross petition for divorce. When his documents were submitted to the court, the sheer scale of his retaliation became clear. He did not accuse Gertrude of a single affair. He accused her of carrying out adulterous relationships with 4 different highly prominent men. His targets were carefully selected to maximize the scandal and completely isolate Gertrude from London high society. The first man named in his petition was George Spencer Churchill, the Marquess of Blandford, who would soon become the 8th Duke of Marlborough. Blandford was a notoriously reckless aristocrat with a string of highly publicized affairs, making him an easy target to associate with scandal. The second man was Captain Eyre Massey Shaw. Captain Shaw was the immensely popular chief officer of the Metropolitan Fire Brigade. He was a Victorian celebrity, a man of action who mixed easily with the upper classes and the royal family. He was even famously referenced in a Gilbert and Sullivan opera. Accusing a beloved public hero of sleeping with his wife was a calculated move by Lord Colin to draw maximum media attention. The third accused was Sir William Gordon Cumming, a wealthy baronet and a prominent officer in the Scots Guards. Gordon Cumming was an intimate friend of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, and a known fixture in the highest, most exclusive social circles. The fourth man was Thomas Bird, a respected surgeon who had actually treated Gertrude during her illness. Accusing her physician of crossing the professional boundary into adultery was a direct attempt to discredit the medical evidence Gertrude relied upon to prove Lord Colin's cruelty. By dragging four prominent men into the crossfire, Lord Colin guaranteed that the trial would be an absolute spectacle. He was gambling that the sheer volume of dirt thrown in Gertrude's direction would stick. To build his case, his private investigators engaged in tactics that defined the term dirty tricks. They bribed Gertrude's disgruntled former servants to provide salacious testimonies. Maids were paid to testify that they had looked through keyholes and seen Gertrude entertaining men in her drawing room. Butlers were coerced into swearing they had found compromising letters. The evidence was flimsy, circumstantial, and largely purchased, but it was enough to force a trial. The British press, previously restrained by the unwritten rules of aristocratic deference, slowly realized the magnitude of what was about to happen. This was not a quiet, discreet annulment. This was a member of the Campbell family, an in-law to the Queen, publicly accusing a future duke, a celebrity firefighter, a baronet, and a doctor of sleeping with his wife, while she counter-accused him of infecting her with a fatal venereal disease contracted from prostitutes. The impending trial became the sole obsession of London society. The establishment elite, who usually closed ranks to protect their own, found themselves entirely fractured. Some supported the Argylls, believing that a wife should never publicly shame her husband, regardless of his actions. Others, horrified by the physical toll the disease had taken on Gertrude, rallied to her defense. As the trial date of November 1886 approached, the tension in the capital reached a breaking point. The court system recognized the explosive nature of the case and assigned it to the president of the Probate, Divorce, and Admiralty Division. Special arrangements had to be made to accommodate the unprecedented number of journalists, lawyers, and spectators demanding access. The doors to the courtroom were about to open. Gertrude Blood was preparing to stand before an all-male judge and an all-male jury to recount the most intimate, humiliating, and agonizing details of her physical destruction. Lord Colin Campbell was preparing to use every resource at his disposal to paint her as a hysterical, disease-ridden adulterer. And watching closely from the heavily guarded corridors of Buckingham Palace, Queen Victoria and her advisors prepared to deploy whatever leverage was necessary to ensure the deepest, darkest secrets of the Campbell family never saw the light of day. The trial commenced in November 1886 at the High Court of Justice in London, and it instantly paralyzed the city. The courtroom itself was a physical manifestation of the power dynamics at play. It was a suffocating oak-paneled arena built by men, presided over by male judges, argued by male barristers, and decided by a male jury. Into this deeply hostile environment walked Gertrude Blood. She was physically ravaged by syphilis and the toxic mercury treatments. Yet she stood with a spine of steel. Across the room sat Lord Colin Campbell, entirely insulated by his arrogance and the invisible armor of his royal connections. The British public completely lost its mind over the spectacle. The era before television and the internet relied entirely on print media, and the Campbell divorce trial became the most lucrative event in the history of Victorian publishing. Newspapers dedicated entire front pages to printing verbatim transcripts of the daily proceedings. Street vendors screamed the latest scandalous updates from the pavement. The public gallery of the courtroom became the most exclusive ticket in London. Aristocrats, politicians, and socialites bribed court officials to secure seats, bringing opera glasses to get a better look at the woman being publicly vivisected. They treated the destruction of Gertrude's life as a highly entertaining matinee. Lord Colin's legal team struck first, and their strategy was built entirely on class exploitation and financial brute force. To prove the absurd claim that Gertrude had conducted affairs with 4 of the most prominent men in England, they paraded a relentless line of former servants into the witness box. These were maids, footmen, and butlers who had been aggressively interviewed, intimidated, and financially compensated by Lord Colin's private investigators. The testimonies they delivered were a master class in fabricated filth. A former maid testified that she had knelt on the floor and peered through a keyhole, claiming she saw Gertrude and the Duke of Marlborough in a compromising embrace in the drawing room. Another servant swore he had found suspicious stains on the upholstery after Captain Ayershaw, the fire chief, had visited the house for tea. A footman claimed he had been ordered to guard the door while Sir William Gordon Cumming was inside. The evidence was almost entirely circumstantial, heavily reliant on the unreliable memories of bribed employees, and focused obsessively on locked doors, drawn curtains, and whispered conversations. The defense subjected these working-class witnesses to brutal cross-examinations, exposing their inconsistencies, their monetary payouts from the Campbell family, and the physical impossibility of seeing through the specific keyholes they claimed to have looked through. Yet the sheer volume of the accusations was designed to exhaust Gertrude and permanently stain her character by association. The 4 accused men were forced to take the stand to defend their own reputations. The Duke of Marlborough, a man not known for his moral purity, fiercely denied the allegations, pointing out the logistical absurdity of conducting a brazen affair in a house swarming with Lord Colin's spies. Captain Shaw, the heroic firefighter, was deeply humiliated by the ordeal. He was a married man with a sterling public record, and being dragged into a syphilis-ridden aristocratic divorce was deeply damaging. The surgeon, Dr. Thomas Bird, testified with cold, professional fury. He explained that his private meetings with Gertrude were entirely medical. He was treating her for the agonizing venereal disease her husband had given her, a disease that required highly private, invasive examinations. When it was Gertrude's turn to testify, the courtroom fell into a dead silence. She was subjected to days of relentless, hostile questioning. Lord Colin's barristers attempted to paint her as a manipulative, highly sexualized woman who had used her husband's illness as an excuse to conduct a string of wild affairs. They demanded she recount the most humiliating details of her marriage bed, her bodily functions, and her medical treatments. She did not break. Gertrude answered their questions with a cold, articulate precision that completely derailed their narrative of female hysteria. She detailed the exact timeline of her physical collapse following the honeymoon. She described the excruciating joint pain, the fevers, and the horrifying realization of what her husband had done to her. She forced the courtroom to look directly at the reality of syphilis, stripping away the polite Victorian euphemisms and exposing the raw, ugly truth of the disease. She was a living contradiction that baffled the Victorian mindset. A woman physically destroyed by her husband's actions, yet mentally unbroken and entirely capable of articulating her own defense. Then came the medical evidence, the absolute core of Gertrude's claim of cruelty. Her lawyers brought forward the top medical specialists in London. The testimonies of these physicians systematically dismantled Lord Colin's defense. The most damning moment of the trial occurred when the surgeon who had examined Lord Colin before the wedding took the stand. Under oath, the doctor confirmed that he had explicitly warned the young aristocrat that he was infected with active syphilis and that marrying Gertrude would be a death sentence for her. Faced with this irrefutable medical testimony, Lord Colin's legal team resorted to a deeply cynical counterattack. They could no longer deny he had a venereal disease. Instead, they tried to argue that the disease he had was a minor infection, something akin to a common rash, and not the deadly syphilis that was currently ravaging his wife. Furthermore, in a breathtaking display of aristocratic audacity, they heavily implied that if Gertrude did have a fatal strain of syphilis, she must have contracted it from one of her 4 alleged lovers, and subsequently passed it to Lord Colin. This argument was medically absurd and contradicted the established timeline of the infection, but it perfectly illustrated the absolute entitlement of the Campbell family. They believed they could bend scientific reality and legal truth simply because they possessed the wealth and the royal connections to do so. But as Gertrude's lawyers pushed back against this fabricated narrative, the trial began to drift toward a highly dangerous precipice. To prove that Lord Colin was the original source of the deadly infection, Gertrude's legal team had to establish his history of sexual behavior prior to the marriage. They needed to explain to the jury exactly how a supposedly respectable member of Parliament had contracted a disease associated with the lowest streetwalkers of London. The questioning began to inch away from the polite drawing rooms of Mayfair and toward the dark, unregulated alleys of the London Underground. Gertrude's barristers started probing into Lord Colin's private habits, his late-night excursions, and the company he kept when he was entirely hidden from the public eye. They were looking for the source of the syphilis. This was the invisible line. This was the boundary that the British establishment could not allow anyone to cross. If the trial exposed Lord Colin's alleged involvement in the dangerous rough trade, if it brought to light his transactions with male sex workers, guardsmen, and the criminal underground, the scandal would instantly detonate. It would not just destroy Lord Colin. It would cast an immediate, unforgiving spotlight on his older brother, the Marquess of Lorne. The rumors surrounding the Queen's son-in-law were already a source of immense anxiety within the royal household. If the Campbell family was publicly exposed as a nexus of homosexuality and venereal disease in open court, the resulting shock wave would hit the throne directly. As the lawyers' questions grew sharper, probing the dark corners of Lord Colin's bachelorhood, a profound shift occurred in the atmosphere of the courtroom. The judge, previously content to let the two parties tear each other apart over allegations of heterosexual adultery, suddenly grew highly restrictive. The invisible machinery of the British establishment was waking up. The trial of Gertrude Blood and Lord Colin Campbell was no longer just a bitter domestic dispute. It had become a direct threat to the structural integrity of the monarchy, and forces far more powerful than the judge or the jury were preparing to intervene to ensure the truth was permanently buried. By the winter of 1886, the trial was no longer just a bitter domestic dispute. It risked exposing a dark, unregulated underworld that could permanently shatter the Crown's carefully crafted illusion of moral superiority, forcing the establishment to reflexively close ranks. The trial of Lord Colin Campbell was perilously close to shattering that illusion permanently. The danger was not simply that a nobleman had contracted a venereal disease. Aristocrats behaving badly was a known, if unspoken, reality. The existential threat lay in the specific origins of that disease and the family it implicated. If Gertrude's brilliant legal team was allowed to continue their aggressive cross-examination, they would inevitably force the court to trace the origin of Lord Colin's syphilis back to its source. They would drag the hidden world of London's underground homosexual networks, the male brothels, and the transactional exploitation of working-class men into the cold, unforgiving light of the public record. This exposure would not be contained to Lord Colin. It would immediately ignite the long-simmering rumors surrounding his older brother, the Marquis of Lorne, husband to Princess Louise. The public would instantly draw a devastating connection, a powerful family intimately tied to the Queen's own daughter, completely corrupted by the most severe sexual taboos of the age. The press, which had already whipped the public into a frenzy over the trial, would have a field day. The scandal would cross international borders, humiliating the British crown on the global stage. The establishment simply could not allow this to happen. The subtle yet overwhelming pressure of the crown began to manifest inside the courtroom of Sir Charles Butt, the judge presiding over the case. Sir Charles was a deeply embedded member of the legal establishment, a man who understood the unwritten boundaries of his profession perfectly. As Gertrude's barristers began to steer their line of questioning toward Lord Colin's bachelor habits and the specific environments he frequented prior to his marriage, the atmosphere in the room visibly hardened. Suddenly, the legal latitude that had been freely granted to Lord Colin's defense team when they were smearing Gertrude's reputation evaporated when the lens was turned on Lord Colin's hidden life. Sir Charles Butt began to aggressively intervene. He sustained objections from the defense with increasing frequency, shutting down any line of inquiry that threatened to expose the underground origins of the disease. The legal justification used to suppress this evidence was a masterclass in Victorian hypocrisy. The court ruled that the trial must focus strictly on the parameters of the marriage itself and the specific allegations of heterosexual adultery filed in the petitions. Lord Colin's life before the wedding, the judge decreed, was immaterial to the current proceedings. Furthermore, to provide a sanitized, socially acceptable explanation for the transmission of the disease, the court heavily favored the narrative that Lord Colin had contracted syphilis from a brief, unfortunate liaison with a female housemaid named Mary Watson. This narrative was medically fragile and logically inconsistent with the timeline of his symptoms, but it served a vital protective purpose. A brief affair with a female servant was a recognizable, heavily categorized form of aristocratic misbehavior. It was a moral failing, certainly, but it was a conventional one. It did not threaten to expose the sprawling, terrifying network of same-sex exploitation that the Crown desperately needed to keep hidden. By focusing the court's attention on Mary Watson, the establishment effectively built a firewall around the truth. The press, too, felt the invisible hand of the establishment. The Victorian media was wildly sensational, but the editors of the major London broadsheets were men of the same class and background as the politicians and judges they reported on. They knew exactly how far they could push a scandal before they crossed a line that would result in social exile and the withdrawal of political access. While they continued to print the salacious details of Gertrude's alleged infidelities and the dramatic testimonies of the bribed servants, The reporting on the origins of Lord Colin's medical condition became notably restrained. The dangerous whispers regarding his London nightlife were carefully excised from the daily columns. The narrative was actively managed and contained. As the trial dragged into its 18th day, becoming the longest and most expensive divorce proceeding in British legal history, the physical and emotional toll on Gertrude Blood was immeasurable. She had been forced to sit in a packed courtroom day after day, listening to men dissect her body, her character, and her trauma. She had watched her husband's lawyers bribe her former staff and parade a series of fabricated lies before the jury. She had seen the legal system, which claimed to operate on the principles of blind justice, actively manipulate the evidence to protect the man who had destroyed her health. Yet she remained steadfast, relying on the sheer, undeniable weight of the medical evidence she had presented. She believed that despite the court's blatant bias, the jury could not possibly ignore the testimony of the leading surgeons in London. They could not ignore the fact that Lord Colin had been explicitly warned of his condition and had chosen to marry her anyway. The closing arguments were delivered in a courtroom vibrating with tension. Gertrude's barristers made a final impassioned plea for justice, asking the jury to look past the smoke and mirrors of the fabricated adultery charges and focus on the undeniable reality of the physical cruelty she had endured. Lord Colin's team delivered a closing statement heavily reliant on class prejudice and misogyny, painting Gertrude as a ruinous woman trying to extort and humiliate a noble family. But the most damaging blow came from the bench. In his final summation to the jury, Judge Sir Charles Butt delivered instructions that were profoundly stacked against Gertrude. He minimized the severity of the medical warnings Lord Colin had received. He leaned heavily into the patriarchal standard of the era, suggesting that the bar for proving a husband's legal cruelty was exceptionally high, requiring a level of malicious, premeditated intent that was difficult to prove. He subtly guided the jury away from the medical facts and toward the preservation of the social order. The all-male jury retired to deliberate. The entire nation held its breath. The fate of the Campbell family, the reputation of the four prominent co-respondents, and the very life of Gertrude Blood rested in the hands of 12 men. When they returned to the courtroom to deliver their verdict, the silence was absolute. The foreman stood and read the decisions. On the charges brought by Lord Colin Campbell, accusing his wife of adultery with the Duke of Marlborough, Captain Ayrshire, Sir William Gordon Cumming, and Dr. Thomas Bird, the jury found Gertrude Blood completely innocent. The fabricated testimonies of the bribed servants had failed to convince them. Gertrude's name regarding the allegations of infidelity was cleared, but the victory was instantly hollowed out by what followed. On the counter-charges brought by Gertrude, accusing Lord Colin of adultery, the jury found him not guilty, largely accepting the sanitized, highly restricted narrative the court had enforced. Finally, they reached the most critical charge, the accusation of cruelty regarding the deliberate transmission of a fatal venereal disease. Despite the sworn testimony of multiple medical experts, despite the clear timeline of infection, and despite the agonizing physical reality of Gertrude's condition, the jury delivered a verdict that defied belief. They ruled that while Lord Colin had infected his wife, he had not done so knowingly, willfully, or recklessly. It was a staggering denial of scientific and historical reality. The jury, heavily influenced by the judge's summation and deeply entrenched in the protective instincts of their era, essentially ruled that handing a woman a death sentence on her honeymoon was just a tragic, unforeseen accident of marriage, not a legal act of cruelty. Because neither party was found legally guilty of the specific thresholds required by the Matrimonial Causes Act, the judge dismissed both petitions for divorce. The verdict was a masterstroke of systemic preservation. By dismissing everything, the court maintained the status quo. The dangerous medical origins were buried, the accused prominent men were cleared, and the Campbell family avoided the ultimate legal disgrace of a finalized divorce based on sexual cruelty. But for Gertrude Blood, the verdict was a waking nightmare. The court had acknowledged her suffering but entirely absolved her abuser of responsibility. She had bankrupted her family, permanently damaged her social standing, and exposed her deepest traumas to the world, only to be told that her husband's actions were legally acceptable. Worse still, the dismissal of the petitions meant that she remained legally bound to Lord Colin Campbell. She was still his wife. She was still a woman infected with a fatal, incurable disease, trapped in a legal union with the man who had knowingly given it to her in a society that had just publicly declared it did not care. The British Crown and the Argyll family had successfully weathered the storm. They had bent the legal system to their will and silenced the truth. But as the courtroom emptied and the crowds dispersed onto the freezing London streets, they were left with a very distinct problem. Lord Colin Campbell was legally victorious, but socially he was radioactive. The trial had made him a pariah, and the establishment, having protected him from legal ruin, now had to figure out how to make him disappear. The gavel fell in the High Court of Justice, and a profound, heavy silence settled over London. The establishment had successfully executed one of the most audacious legal maneuvers of the century by dismissing the divorce petitions of both Gertrude Blood and Lord Colin Campbell. The court had legally frozen the conflict. It had officially declared that nothing of consequence had happened, that the marriage was intact, and that the horrifying medical evidence presented over 18 grueling days was insufficient to rupture the sacred bonds of an aristocratic union. But legal absolution and social survival are two entirely different currencies in the economy of the British elite. The morning after the verdict, Lord Colin Campbell awoke a free man in the eyes of the law, yet he was utterly destroyed. He had fundamentally misunderstood the rules of the society he belonged to. He believed that because his family was intimately tied to Queen Victoria, and because the courts had shielded his darkest secrets from the public record, his peers would welcome him back into the fold. He assumed the wealth and the towering political weight of the Argyll dynasty would simply pave over the ugliness of the trial. He was devastatingly wrong. The Victorian aristocracy did not despise vice. They despised exposure. The ruling class operated on an ironclad code of discretion. A gentleman could maintain mistresses, frequent underground clubs, and ruin his finances at the gambling tables, provided he did so with a veneer of absolute respectability. The unforgivable sin was not the act of cruelty or depravity itself, but the clumsiness of getting caught. Lord Colin had not just been caught, he had dragged the entire establishment into a sprawling, filthy public spectacle. He had forced the British public to look directly at the rampant hypocrisy of their rulers. He had jeopardized the reputation of the Queen's own son-in-law. For that, he had to be punished. What followed was the swift, silent, and brutal execution of a Victorian social death. It began in the exclusive gentlemen's clubs of St. James's, the true centers of political and social power in London. When Lord Colin walked into the rooms he had frequented for years, conversations abruptly stopped. Men he had gone to Cambridge with, men he had served alongside in the House of Commons, suddenly found themselves deeply fascinated by their newspapers or the pattern of the carpets. When he approached a group, the circle would quietly but deliberately close, offering him only the backs of their coats. This was the cut direct, the most severe social weapon of the era. It was a complete refusal to acknowledge a person's existence. The invitations to country house weekends, shooting parties, and royal banquets simply evaporated. His political career, once so promising, was instantly extinguished. The Liberal Party could not afford the liability of having a man synonymous with syphilis and public scandal sitting on their benches. He was quietly but firmly encouraged to resign his seat in Parliament. The protective bubble of the Campbell name, which had saved him from legal ruin, was completely inverted to isolate him. The family realized that the only way to preserve the dignity of the Duke of Argyll and the safety of the crown was to surgically remove the infected limb. Behind the heavily guarded doors of Inverary Castle and Buckingham Palace, the quiet, ruthless logistics of exile were arranged. There were no public statements, no formal decrees of banishment. The machinery of the British Empire simply opened a trapdoor. Throughout the 19th century, the sprawling territories of the British Empire served a dual purpose. They were vast engines of wealth and resources, but they were also highly convenient dumping grounds for the embarrassing, the disgraced, and the financially ruined sons of the aristocracy. When a nobleman accumulated too much gambling debt or engaged in an unacceptable scandal, he was quietly packed onto a ship and sent to govern a province, manage a tea plantation, or practice law in a colony thousands of miles away from the London press. For Lord Colin, the chosen destination was Bombay, India. The arrangement was presented under the thin face-saving guise of a career change. It was announced that Lord Colin Campbell, seeking new opportunities, was relocating to India to establish a legal practice and serve in the colonial administration. In reality, it was a one-way ticket to oblivion. The family provided him with a substantial allowance, ensuring he would live in the comfort expected of a duke's son, but the unspoken condition of this financial support was absolute distance. He was never to return to London society. He was never to draw attention to himself again. The journey to India in the late 1880s was a grueling passage, a long, slow severing of ties from everything he had ever known. When Lord Colin arrived in Bombay, he stepped into a world completely alien to the damp, fog-choked streets of London. Bombay was a thriving, chaotic, and relentlessly hot colonial metropolis. Here, the British ruled as a tiny, isolated elite over a vast local population. Within the rigid hierarchy of the British Raj, a man with the title of Lord and a direct familial link to the Queen commanded immediate, unquestioning deference from the colonial civil service and the local subjects. In Bombay, he was provided with a large, airy bungalow staffed by a small army of servants. He joined the exclusive colonial clubs, where the scandals of London were treated as distant rumors, superseded by the immediate realities of imperial administration. He was granted a position that required minimal actual labor, but provided a veneer of official importance. On the surface, it appeared to be a remarkably soft landing for a man who had destroyed his wife's life. But the reality of his exile was a slow, agonizing descent. The British establishment could exile his body, but they could not exile the disease that was ravaging his bloodstream. The harsh climate of Bombay only accelerated his physical decline. In this gilded cage, thousands of miles from the halls of Westminster, Lord Colin was forced to confront the absolute ruin of his life. He was surrounded by deference, but entirely devoid of true companionship. The political ambitions that had defined his youth were ashes, and the family that had sworn to protect him had paid him to disappear. He spent his days in the shadowed rooms of his bungalow, a ghost haunting the edges of the empire, watching his own body slowly fail as the tertiary stage of syphilis systematically dismantled his nervous system. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, a prison built on the arrogance of his class and his absolute disregard for the woman he had married. Back in London, the woman he had left behind was facing a completely different kind of exile. When the gavel had fallen dismissing the divorce petitions, Gertrude Blood was effectively abandoned by the state. The legal system had recognized her profound physical suffering, verified by the top medical minds of the country, yet ruled that she must remain legally shackled to the man who inflicted it. Because she was not granted a divorce, she could not remarry. She could not easily reclaim her maiden name in legal documents. She was permanently branded as Lady Colin Campbell, a title that now carried the heavy, suffocating weight of public scandal and venereal disease. Her financial situation was equally precarious. The grueling 18-day trial had cost an astronomical sum of money. The legal fees had severely depleted her family's resources. Lord Colin, having been cleared of the specific legal thresholds of cruelty and adultery, was under no immediate pressing obligation to maintain her in the lavish lifestyle she had briefly known. He was gone, his allowance secured in India, leaving her to navigate the wreckage in London. Victorian society, having ruthlessly ostracized Lord Colin for his clumsy exposure of their secrets, was not inclined to be merciful to Gertrude either. The rules of engagement for a woman in her position were devastatingly clear. A woman tainted by the public discussion of sexual disease and accused, even falsely, of multiple affairs, was considered deeply compromised. The polite drawing rooms of Mayfair and Belgravia quietly closed their doors to her. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. She was expected to retreat to the countryside, live quietly on whatever small allowance her parents could provide, and fade into obscurity as a tragic, ruined creature. She was expected to quietly die of the disease she carried. The profound injustice of the Matrimonial Causes Act had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had protected the patriarchal institution of marriage at the absolute expense of the woman's humanity. The establishment had washed its hands of the entire affair. But as Gertrude sat in her diminished London lodgings, battling the chronic, exhausting flare-ups of the syphilis in her system, she made a realization that would alter the course of her life. She realized that the society that was demanding her disappearance was fundamentally hypocritical and entirely unworthy of her obedience. They had rigged the game, protected the abuser, and demanded the victim pay the price. She looked at the reality of her situation. She was physically damaged, socially isolated, and legally trapped. But she was also free from the suffocating presence of Lord Colin Campbell. The worst had already happened. The absolute most terrifying secrets of her life had been printed in the morning papers and shouted by street vendors. She had survived the public vivisection of her marriage. The society that had judged her no longer held any power to frighten her. Gertrude Blood realized she had nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing left to lose is a highly dangerous force to a society built on compliance. She decided she was not going to retreat to the country. She was not going to hide her face behind a veil. And she was certainly not going to die quietly to make the Argyle family comfortable. The disease inside her might eventually take her life, but until that day came, she was going to reclaim her identity on her own terms. The establishment had stripped her of her aristocratic future, but they had not touched her sharp intellect, her artistic talent, or her deep underlying fury. The chapter of the victim, the tragic lady, Colin Campbell weeping in the divorce courts, was definitively closed. It was time to write a new one. In the face of absolute social ruin, Gertrude began the slow, painful, and deeply defiant process of reinventing herself in the very city that had tried to destroy her. The society that cast Gertrude Blood out expected her to follow a highly specific, heavily enforced script for fallen women. The Victorian establishment had a very clear understanding of how a ruined woman should behave. She was supposed to shrink away in shame, change her name, move to a quiet provincial village, and dedicate her remaining shortened years to silent repentance. She was expected to become a ghost long before her physical body actually expired. Gertrude tore that script to pieces. She looked at the reality of her situation. She was financially strapped, her reputation was publicly shredded, and she carried a fatal disease in her bloodstream. The aristocratic world of Mayfair and Belgravia, the world of royal enclosures and exclusive drawing rooms, had bolted its doors against her. But London in the late 1880s and 1890s was not a monolith. It was a sprawling, rapidly modernizing metropolis. And while the old aristocratic guard was obsessed with pedigree and propriety, a new, entirely different world was emerging in the city's heart. This was the world of the bohemians, the artists, the writers, and the radical thinkers. This was a society built not on bloodlines or royal favor, but on merit, wit, and sheer creative output. They did not care who your father was, and they certainly did not care if you had scandalized the Queen's family. In fact, among the avant-garde, having terrified the conservative establishment was often viewed as a badge of honor. Gertrude recognized that to survive, she needed to pivot away from the world that had rejected her and embrace the world that valued what she still possessed: a brilliant mind, a sharp tongue, and an unyielding will to live. She made a decision that was, for a titled woman of her era, almost as scandalous as her divorce trial. She decided to go to work. She was going to support herself, and she was going to do it in the aggressively male-dominated, highly competitive world of London journalism. The transition was not easy. The world of print media was notoriously rough. Newsrooms were filled with cigar smoke, shouting men, and brutal deadlines. Women journalists were a rarity, often relegated to writing anonymous fluff pieces about domestic life or society gossip. But Gertrude refused to hide behind a pseudonym. She understood the power of branding, even a tainted one. She wrote under the name that the courts had permanently affixed to her, Lady Colin Campbell. It was a deliberate provocation. It told the establishment that she was still here, she was still speaking, and they could not erase her. She began contributing articles to various prominent publications, including the Pall Mall Gazette and the Saturday Review. She did not write about polite, feminine subjects. She tackled art criticism, literature, theater, and social commentary. She wrote with a forceful, articulate clarity that immediately commanded attention. Her prose was not the delicate, flowery language expected of a Victorian lady. It was sharp, insightful, and often deeply critical of the very social hypocrisies that had ruined her marriage. Her breakthrough came with a regular column titled A Woman's Walks. In these pieces, she explored London on foot, observing the city with a keen analytical eye. She wrote about everything from the squalor of the East End to the changing dynamics of the modern city. She proved herself to be a highly capable, immensely talented writer. Her editors quickly realized that her scandalous name might draw readers in, but her sheer talent is what kept them reading. As her career in journalism flourished, Gertrude became a central figure in London's bohemian and literary circles. She established a salon in her modestly sized but elegantly decorated London flat. This space became a sanctuary for the brightest minds of the generation. Men and women who were actively dismantling the rigid structures of the Victorian era gathered around her fireplace. Among her closest friends and admirers was a young, fiercely intelligent Irish playwright named George Bernard Shaw. Shaw, who was famously critical of the British aristocracy and the oppressive nature of Victorian marriage laws, viewed Gertrude not as a ruined woman, but as a survivor of a corrupt system. He was deeply fascinated by her intellect and her resilience. He famously referred to her as a goddess and engaged in long-spirited debates with her about art, socialism, and the future of society. She also became a muse and confidant to James McNeill Whistler, the brilliant, notoriously abrasive American painter who was shaking the foundations of the traditional art world. Whistler painted her portrait, capturing not the tragic victim of the divorce courts, but the commanding, self-assured woman she had willed herself to become. In these circles, Gertrude was not defined by the disease she carried or the husband who had betrayed her. She was defined by her own merit, but she did not just write about art and society. She became a vocal advocate for physical freedom. In the 1890s, the invention of the safety bicycle sparked a massive cultural revolution, particularly for women. The bicycle offered unprecedented mobility, allowing women to travel independently without chaperones or expensive carriages. Gertrude grasped the liberating potential of this machine immediately. She became an avid cyclist and a highly public champion for the cause. She wrote extensively on the subject, arguing that the bicycle was a critical tool for female emancipation. More importantly, she used her platform to attack the restrictive, highly dangerous Victorian dress codes. It was impossible to ride a bicycle effectively while wearing a corset and heavy floor-length skirts. Gertrude publicly advocated for rational dress, lighter fabrics, shorter hemlines, and split skirts, arguing that a woman's health and freedom of movement were far more important than the suffocating mandates of polite fashion. For a woman who had been physically destroyed by the dictates of aristocratic marriage, advocating for physical autonomy was a deeply personal revolutionary act. Yet behind the glittering salon conversations, the acclaimed journalism and the public advocacy, the dark, terrifying reality of her life remained ever present. The reinvention of Lady Colin Campbell is one of the most inspiring stories of the late 19th century, but it is also one of the most heartbreaking. The public saw a vibrant, witty, fiercely independent woman. They saw her holding her own against the greatest writers and artists of the age. They saw her riding her bicycle through Hyde Park, a symbol of modern, liberated womanhood. What they did not see was the absolute physical agony it took to maintain that facade. Syphilis does not negotiate, and in the 1890s it could not be stopped. As Gertrude built her new life, the Treponema pallidum bacteria continued to quietly, relentlessly devour her from the inside out. The disease is characterized by periods of latency where the symptoms seemingly vanish, followed by brutal, debilitating flare-ups. There were days when the joint pain was so severe she could barely hold a pen, let alone write the columns she relied on to pay her rent. There were weeks when she was confined to her bed, battling fevers, terrifying skin lesions, and the bone-deep exhaustion that accompanied the infection. The medical treatments she continued to endure, the toxic mercury regimens, only added to her suffering, causing chronic nausea and slowly damaging her internal organs. The sheer willpower required to wake up in a body that is actively destroying itself, and to then dress in the height of fashion, attend a theater premiere, and write a sharp, coherent critique by the morning deadline is almost unfathomable. Her life was an exercise in extreme compartmentalization. She fought a daily desperate war against her own failing biology, completely hidden from the public eye. She refused to let the establishment see her suffer. She refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Lord Colin Campbell's exile offered no escape from his biology. By the mid-1890s, late-stage syphilis had destroyed his internal organs and nervous system. He died in Bombay on June 18, 1895, at age 42. His death was met with an orchestrated silence from the British establishment. The Argyll family swiftly erased him from their official history. For Gertrude, the news of his death officially freed her from the legal constraints of her marriage. Despite her rapidly deteriorating physical condition, as tertiary syphilis progressed, she refused to fade into obscurity. She spent her final years working as a formidable art critic, confined to a wheelchair, but continuing to host London's intellectual elite. Gertrude Blood died on November 1st, 1911. While the aristocracy had tried to discard her, she forged a legacy of uncompromising resilience, remembered today as a pioneer for women's independence in a deeply restrictive era.